In this video, we're going to be talking about percent change or percent of change. And our essential questions are, what is percent change and how do you calculate it? And what is percent error and how do you calculate it? So what is percent change? A percent of change is a percent that compares the amount something changes to the original amount. So we're using a percent to describe an amount of change, how much something has changed. There are two types of percent change. There is a percent of increase, which is a percent that describes an increase from the original amount. And there's a percent of decrease, and that's a percent that describes a decrease from the original amount. So how do you calculate a percent of change? Well, we're going to use a proportion. So hopefully you should be comfortable solving proportions at this point, and we're going to use a proportion to describe or calculate a percent of change. So the first thing we want to do is use subtraction to find the amount of increase or decrease. That's going to be the change. So we're going to subtract the original amount and then the new amount to find out how much something has changed. And then we're going to use the percent of change proportion to find the percent of change. So what's different about this is that this is usually the part and this is usually the whole. So the change is kind of the part and the original amount we started with is the whole. This ratio on this side is still the same, is always a percent out of 100. So let's take a look at an example of calculating a percent change. The number of students in the middle school was 250, but now there are 300 students. Find the percent of change. So we want to describe how much the population of the middle school changed, but use a percent. So the first thing we need to do is to use subtraction to find the amount of increase or decrease. We're going to find the change. Now we want to subtract these in a way to where we get a positive number each time. So we're always going to take the bigger number minus the smaller number to find out how much it changed. So the new amount was 300. It used to be 250, so that's a change of 50 students. So the number of students increased by 50. So the change was an increase of 50, but what percent of change was that? So that's where step 2 comes in. We're going to use the percent of change proportion to find the percent of change. So I need to know how much it changed and what it was originally. So it changed 50. So this was the amount of change. This is what the population was originally, 250. So there's my ratio there, and then my percent ratio here. And when I solve this, 250 divided by 5 is 50. There's a nice vertical relationship there. So if you take 100 divided by 5, you'll find the percent, which is 20%. So then we conclude right here, there was a 20% increase in the number of students. And we need to make sure when we describe a percent of change that we're using the word increase or decrease. There was a 20% increase in the number of students because it increased from 250 to 300 students. So that's another way to describe the change in the number of students. Rather than saying we just got 50 more students, we increased the population of middle schoolers by 20%. Last week, the price of gas was $2.75 per gallon. This week, it is $2.60 per gallon. Find the percent change in the cost of gas. So we want to describe how much the cost has changed. So we need to find out how much it changed. So that's our first step. Use subtraction to find out how much it changed. So I take 275 minus 260, and I get a change of 15 cents. So this is the change in the price of gas. And then step 2, I'm going to use the proportion where I use that change here. The change was 15 cents. The original was $2.75. So that goes in the denominator. And now I have my proportion. And then if I solve this proportion, I used cross products to solve this. I'm not going to show that work because we've seen that many times. You get 5.45 repeating. So the price of gas changed 5.45 repeating percent. So I rounded that to the nearest tenth. When I get a repeating decimal, I usually round to the nearest tenth. So I can conclude the price of gas decreased about 5.5% over the last week. So there was a 5.5% decrease in the price of gas. Notice I used the word decreased because the price went down. Always make sure you're using the word decreased or increased in your percent change problems. Let's take a look at a couple more. Here we want to find the percent change in each situation. So we had a change from $12 to $8. So the first thing we want to do is find out how much that change is. So I just use subtraction. 12 minus 8 is 4. So that's the amount of change. And now I'm going to use my proportion. Change over original equals percent over 100. So the change was $4. The original amount I had was $12. And that's how much out of 100. Here's my proportion. Nice vertical relationship here. 12 divided by 3 is 4. So if I take 100 divided by 3, that will tell me my percent change. 100 divided by 3 is 33.3 repeating percent, and this was a decrease because it went from $12 down to $8. So that's a 33 and 1/3% decrease in the amount of money. Next, we had a change of 240 feet to 412.8 feet. What is the percent of change? So again, the first thing I need to do is subtraction, find out how much it changed. And when I subtract these numbers, I get a change of 172.8 feet. And now I can use that number in this proportion. That's the change, 172.8. Originally, it was 240 feet, and that's x out of 100. Now be very careful when you're putting your numbers in this left-hand ratio. A lot of seventh graders will mess this up. They'll just put either the original and the new, or they'll use the new amount as the original. Just make sure you're using the correct numbers here. This numerator is always the change, and the denominator is always the original. So I solved this proportion. I use cross products here, and I get 17,280, and 240 times x is 17,280. And then I divide 17,280 by 240 to find my answer, and x is 72. So this was a 72% increase since it went up from 240 to 412 feet. So this is a 72% increase. So find the percent and then make sure you note whether it's an increase or a decrease, and that is percent of change. What is percent error? Percent error is a percent that compares the amount of error to the actual amount. Percent error is used to describe error in estimates or measurements. So it's very similar to a percent of change. So it's calculated in a very similar way. So here's how we calculate a percent error. Again, the first thing we're going to do is use subtraction to find out the amount of error. How far off were we on our estimate or our measurement? And then we're going to use this proportion to find the percent error. So again, it's a very similar proportion, but this left-hand ratio is slightly different. This is the amount of error, or kind of like the change, and this was the actual amount. So here's an example. Brenda guessed that there were 300 marbles in a jar. There were actually 400 marbles in the jar. What was her percent error? How far off was she described using a percent? So the first thing we want to do is find out the amount of error. How far off was she? So we take 400 minus 300 to find out how far she was off. Brenda was off by 100 marbles. So that's the amount I'm going to use in my proportion. That's the amount of error she had. She was off by 100 marbles. So that goes here in the numerator. The actual amount was 400. That's why that goes in the denominator. So here's my proportion again. And again, there's a nice vertical relationship here. 400 divided by 4 is 100. So 100 divided by 4 will tell me my percent error, and that's 25. So x is 25%. So Brenda's guess was off by 25%. Now, this wasn't an increase or a decrease, so we don't have to use the words increase or decrease here, but we can say she was off, or she had 25% error, or something like that, to show that her estimate wasn't accurate. It was off by 25%. Here we need to find the percent error in each situation. This week, Mrs. Mariota estimated her grocery bill would be $120, but she actually spent $125. So her estimate wasn't completely accurate. So how far off was she? So the first thing we want to do is find out how far off she was, or how much error she had. So I'm going to use subtraction. 125 minus 120 is 5. So she was off by $5. So what percent is that compared to what she actually spent? So 5 out of 125, because this is the actual amount she spent, is how much out of 100? And then you can solve this proportion any way you want. I use cross products. That's a pretty popular method. So 125 times x has to be 500. 500 divided by 125 is 4. So that's 4%. So Mrs. Mariota's estimate was off by 4%. She had 4% error in her estimate of her grocery bill. Next, Jessie estimated the weight of her cat to be 10 pounds. The actual weight of her cat is 12.5 pounds. Find the percent error. How far off was Jessie on her estimate? So to do that, the first thing we need to do is find out how much she was off. We're going to use subtraction. 12.5 minus 10 is 2.5. So she was off 2.5 pounds. So what percent is that? We have to find out what percent that is using the percent error proportion. This was the amount of error. The actual amount was 12.5 pounds. So that goes in the denominator. How much is that out of 100? And then again, I use cross product to solve this. 100 times 2.5 is 250. So 12.5 times x is 250. So I take 250 divided by 12.5 to find out what x is, and that gives me 20. So 20%. So Jesse's estimate was off by 20%. So using similar proportions here to find percent of change and to find percent error.